Holy Gospel is written in the 15th chapter of St. Luke, beginning at the first verse. All the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. There was a man who had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of my property that will belong to me." So they divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place, throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger? I will get up, go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father, but while he was still far off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran out, put his arms around him, and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now the elder son was in the field, and we came and approached the house. He heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he had got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, and you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and he has been found.'" Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. I heard a story of a man who began to go to the movies for the first time. And when he went to the first movie, he saw the opening credits for the film that was about to be shown. And it was that MGM lion. That MGM lion that was head is in a circle, and he has that roar that begins the process of the movie. Well, he had liked his first experience going to the theater. He came back a second time. Once again, it was an MGM movie. He saw the credits come up and the lion make his roar, and he said, "Oh, I must have seen this movie," and went out before he could see how it progressed. This is kind of the way some of us treat a parable like the one we have today. Because most of you, particularly those who have been to church all your life, have heard this parable many, many times. You know it probably as well as any parable in the Bible. You know, when we start, we just say a man had two sons, and one came to him and asked for his inheritance. You know what it's about. You know how it's going to end. And I think some of you might be tempted to turn off at that point, say, "We know how it ends." I've heard this parable numerous times, and most of the time it concentrates on the father who just forgives at the end. And sometimes it centers on the brother who is angry because when his wayward brother comes home, he has a fatted calf and a great celebration, and he really never had that. And he's angry. He's been treated unjustly because this person, his brother who is worth nothing, gets all the praise just for coming back. When I was in sermon prep this last week, something was pointed out that I never saw in this parable before, and I think might be the most powerful part of the parable. And there were a couple of points that I would like to bring to your attention today, because I've been looking at this parable for years and years, and probably could recite it for the most part by heart, but I missed a very important thing. So here's point number one. What is interesting about this parable is nothing really happens in it until the prodigal son admits to making a mistake. He makes a confession. You just heard the story. He gets inheritance. Instead of making wise investments and starting up a business, he spends it in wild and licentious living. And he winds up in a pig pen. But he makes a decision at that point. And there are a few words that can change the nature of your life. He says, I am no longer worthy. I am no longer worthy to be my father's son. And as soon as that happens, as soon as it becomes a real confession of the heart, nothing happens. But when he makes that confession, things start to go in the right direction. 3 weeks ago, I talked about the temptation. I talked about 3 major temptations that we have. And the one we had the sermon we had last week kind of amplified the first temptation we have, to do nothing. And this parable today kind of amplifies the second one, the one about taking personal responsibility. Well, some of the critics of this parable would say, well, the son returned home and was very repentant because he wanted his father to act mercifully. That is a possible interpretation, but it's hard to understand that that son really thought that the father would be merciful. He had done everything wrong. He had made a mistake. And he wasn't expecting necessarily from the father, except that he wanted to eat. But he was truly repentant. And we came to the father. He made the confession, I really am not worthy to be your son. I would like to be able to eat. I would like to work as one of your hired servants, the lowest rank in the household. I don't expect you to show me any favors. See, when he came to this realization in the pig pen, when he was trying to compete with the pigs for eating the pods of peas, he made a decision. I've screwed things up. I made a bad mistake. But with that realization comes a solution. But there is still a chance that I can do something correct. There is still a possibility I can do something that will make my life significant. I will go back to my father's house. I will make full confession. So the second part of this whole activity he has, not only to make the confession, but then had a plan. And the third thing he did right and showed that he was serious about this confession is he acted on it. He did something. He did go back. And we have every reason to believe that once he became a part of his father's household and was working as a hired hand, even though his father received him back as his son, that he probably did his work the way he was supposed to and lived a fairly productive life. That's the first point of the parable that I've missed. Things start to happen when you say, I am not worthy to be your son. Because then comes the ability to foster a plan and to work through it and rectify and become a son again. Because we know that the Father always has the outstretched hands. The second point is interesting, but it presents some problems. The Father represents God in this case, is fairly stable. We don't see much about him as far as helping his son to make a decision. Kind of stands back and lets things happen. When he came to his father, it would have been very easy for his father to say, no, I'm not giving you half the inheritance. That's dumb. That's not even tradition. I have no obligation to do that. And some people might think that his father was very irresponsible to give the son half the money, but somehow along the way, the father said, no, I'm going to let him do it. He's got to learn to be responsible. He just didn't get involved. Why didn't the Father straighten him out right from the beginning? And sometimes we say this in terms of our relationship with God. Well, why didn't God straighten us right from the beginning? Why wasn't he there acting like a responsible parent and telling me not to make all these foolish mistakes? See, the Father was interested in being the Father and being there to receive him back, but he was not interested in being his son's rescuer. He let him fail. He let him come to the point where he was in the pig pen. And it might have broken the Father's heart to see him there, but he allowed it to happen in order for him to get hold of his own life. See, that presents a problem because we like to think God is always there. And we see one of the Psalms which says God is our ever-present refuge and strength, always present in our behalf. And when we say this, we kind of think that God is some kind of automatic robot that we can press a button and all of a sudden he will come and rescue. God isn't always interested in rescuing us. He's willing to be that responsible parent that lets the child make decisions even though sometimes they fail miserably in those decisions. The flip side of this is another psalm says, why, Lord, do you stand so far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Why do you hide your face from me? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? And I guess the answer would be there's something to be said for letting us find our own way home when we admit our mistakes. See, when we feel God is afar off, God hasn't moved. I told you the story before about that couple who had been married for about 7 years, and the wife was beginning to complain about the relationship. And we were driving down the highway, and she said to her husband, she said, things were better when we were courting because, when we went on a trip like this, I sat close to you. And he said, well, I haven't moved. That's kind of what God says when we say, well, God, you're not close to us. It's we that have taken the path and left. God has still remained in the same place. Anglican pastor H. Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled, had an interesting dialogue. When he was in Okinawa, must have been a military chaplain, he was to see some wife of one of the soldiers there in Okinawa who had tried to commit suicide and slit her wrists. And Scott Peck recorded this dialogue that went on. Peck asked her why she had done it. She said, well, to kill myself, of course. And why do you want to kill yourself? Because I can't stand on this dumb island. You have to send me back to the States. I'm going to kill myself if I have to stay here any longer. What is it about living in Okinawa that's so painful for you? She began to cry in a whining sort of way. I don't have any friends here, and I'm all alone all the time. Well, that's too bad, said Scott Peck. How come you haven't been able to make any friends? Because I have to live in the stupid Okinawa housing area, and none of the neighbors speak English. Then why don't you drive over to the American housing area to the Wives Club during the day so you can make some friends with people who speak English? Because my husband has to drive to work. Can't you drive him to work since you're alone and bored all day? No, it's a stick shift car, and I don't know how to drive a stick shift car, only an automatic. Why don't you learn how to drive a stick shift car? She glared at Peck. On these roads, you must be crazy. Peck makes this observation. She's in a bad place. She's kind of away from everything that's important. But she has no attempt to take command of her own situation and discover that she's the cause of her own problem. She doesn't get to the place, well, I'm stupid. I've acted irresponsibly. I haven't taken care of my situation. And then be able to solve the problem. The Old Testament text is the celebration of 40 years in the wilderness and a 40-year celebration of the Passover. It's about when the Israelites get into the promised land and they celebrate their escape from freedom. They've done this. One of the things that had happened during the wilderness is God provided manna, food, in the morning, every morning, enough for the day. He had literally taken care of them the whole trip, even though they grumbled and complained the whole way. When they came and had this celebration in Gilgal, God says, okay, no more manna. No more providing, no more rescuing. You're on your own. You have this land, it's a land of promise, a land of milk and honey. Now you be responsible. When you see a bird push its young off the branch, it's not to kill them, it's not to have them drop on the ground. It's to show them that they need to fly. And the power of this parable is sometimes God leaves you on your own to make your own mistakes, discover that when you fail, that you need to turn for help. And when you do, there will be a Father there with open arms. Amen.